I imagine that many of you are here because you're called to focus on your own well-being and the well-being of your students. Hopefully thinking about self-care and turning that towards yourself. That is the definition of self-care. So we're going to talk a little bit about self-care, how mindfulness is an act of self-care. And then I want to share just a couple of strategies and practices with you, and then some resources that I think might be of interest to you. So it wasn't that long ago that I was in the classroom, and I still remember coming back from summer vacation and saying hello to my teaching colleagues, and we would be in awe and just completely surprised at how good we looked, how well we seemed. It was almost shockingly surprising how well we thought we each looked. And this happened year after year. And what I realized after a few years was that how we looked at the beginning of the school year stood in stark contrast to how we looked at the end of the year. Educators are often called to the work, and it often comes, we give it everything typically, but that often comes at the expense of our own well-being and self-care. And the research really shows that teachers experience the highest rates of daily stress among any professional group, tied with nurses and greater than physicians. So it's really important that we take a look at and be very intentional about focusing on self-care, because it's very clear from the research, and for those of you who are teachers, we know this, it's an embodied experience of feeling stress. So we need to resource ourselves, and that's what we're going to talk about today. One of the best definitions of self-care that I know comes from Audre Lorde, who is a social justice activist, librarian, and writer. And she said, caring for myself is not self-indulgence, it is self-preservation. And that is an act of political warfare. Another entry point into thinking about self-care, and I share this a lot, is that familiar message we get on the airplane that we should secure our own oxygen masks before securing someone else's, because if we were to run out of oxygen, we wouldn't be able to help someone else. When I get asked by teachers, teacher candidates, teacher educators, and administrator, what is the most powerful mindfulness strategy for the classroom? My answer is always the same. It's your practice. Even if teachers do not, or parents don't introduce mindfulness to children, there will be a ripple effect in the classroom, because our nervous systems as educators, we're at the helm. And so my good friend Dana Chapman calls it the heartbeat of the classroom. And I like to think of it as the nervous system of the classroom. We set the tone. And what we know from stress contagion, research around mirror neurons, if we are feeling calm, if we are feeling at ease, our students are going to feel at ease. And it's a reciprocal relationship. We know as teachers and educators, when our students are stressed, it elevates our stress. So it's beneficial for both us and for students when we are feeling more calm. So this brings me to mindfulness as one entry point. There are a number of ways to take care of ourselves. Mindfulness is one of those. And for those of you in the room who might be new to mindfulness, it's an innate capacity we all have to pay full and conscious attention in the moment. We all have that capacity. It's the quality of presence we bring to everything we do. The problem is the quality of that presence isn't really very good for all of us. We spend a lot of time in this sort of default mode of being a time traveler, thinking about the past, worrying about the future. And one of the examples I like to share is, because most of us have had the experience of driving or being in a car, going from point A to point B, and having little or no recollection of what we passed along the way. That's called mindlessness. And we're often in that default mode. Our minds get hijacked. The thing is, the research shows, a Harvard study showed, that our minds wander 47% of the time, which means we're spending almost half of our waking hours thinking about something other than what we're doing or where we are. And the research showed that this impacts our happiness levels negatively and impacts our resilience and level of stress. So it's important to think about how we can be more mindful and do less mind wandering to impact our levels of our resilience and our ability to put our attention where we want it to be and keep it there. So mindfulness practice, though we have the innate capacity for mindfulness, the more that we practice mindfulness, the better we can become at being mindful. Think of it as a skill that can be practiced and strengthened every day. So if you think about exercising your mind, your body to keep it healthy and resilient, we can do the same thing for our brains to keep them healthy, resilient, and strong. So mindfulness is, the roots of it goes, contemplative practices that go back thousands of years. We think about mindfulness in school settings, in university settings, in companies, in professional sports, as more of skill building. It's secular in nature, and that's what we think about when we bring mindfulness into schools. 5-finger breathing is another exercise that uses the breath, but there are some folks that aren't comfortable focusing on the breath for a whole host of reasons. This allows adults and children, this is something I do, I know adults have done this as well. 5-finger breathing gives us an opportunity to have a tactile cue and a visual cue for our attention as we're focusing on the breathing. So 5-finger breathing, which is a favorite of students, invites us to start with our finger at the bottom of our wrist, and you draw your finger up. So there's the tactile experience and movement as we breathe in. Slight pause, and then exhale as we draw our finger down the inside of our thumb. And then again, breathing in as we draw our finger up, and then breathing out after a slight pause as we draw our finger down. So that's 5-finger breathing. I've seen children do this exercise when we were in the classroom with their hands underneath the desk. I've seen adults do this as well. It's a tactile and visual way to focus our attention on our breath without having to think about our breath as we do that.
I am in my 10th year teaching a specialized program for autistic children who 4 days a week are integrated into the general classroom setting. And then they come to me 1 day a week for some social and self-regulatory supports. And I'm blessed to be able to work with them over 3 years. So during that time, I'm collaborating, obviously, with my students, with their families, and with their classroom teachers. And that level of collaboration has really helped me grow as an educator and gain practice and tips for practice. And that's the inspiration for this book. And the book combines some theory with practice, and it's grounded in the voices of my students. So the simplest way I can describe autism is a difference in brain wiring that leads to different ways of experiencing and processing the world. It's considered a developmental disability. And in learners like my students, their challenges are often masked by their average cognitive and language abilities. And it can be quite baffling for teachers when they encounter roadblocks because teachers can't see what's going on in the brains of our students. And that's something when I deliver PD, teachers are always very interested in learning about. Now, before I get into the lessons from my students, I want to introduce you to my brother, Danny. And he is one of my favorite human beings in the whole world. And I remember when we were growing up, when he was in school, he would go very easily into shutdown mode if anyone raised their voice, if they gave complex directions he just couldn't process, if the demands felt too overwhelming. But at home, I found that I could coax him to try things that were out of his comfort zone or maybe a little bit difficult for him, simply by giving him time to process, slowing things down, and of course, working in all his favorite Nintendo characters into whatever it was we were trying to do. And I'm so grateful to Danny because he gave me such a solid foundation to start out with as a teacher before I even knew I wanted to be a teacher. Last year, when I was preparing for an in-service, I asked my students what they wished adults knew. And almost all of them said, don't yell. Because even if what you are trying to relay might be positive, like I observed a teacher saying, "Happy holidays, everyone," in one of my students' classes, and he turned around to me and said, "See, she's mean." The message may not be received because of those sensory issues, The loud voice can be scary, it can be painful, and it's unpredictable. So I'm always trying to think about the experiences of my students, how they may be feeling on edge from everything accumulating until I'm finally going to make a request that exceeds their capacity at that moment. And it's made me start to think about my own reactions kind of like a seesaw. How I react can either fling them off into a complete meltdown or total shutdown, or I can bring them gently down. And so I've learned, I was not always great at this at the beginning, but I've definitely learned to stay calm, to be logical, and to use less language when a child is upset, because they won't be able to process what I'm saying. I'll just be like the Charlie Brown teacher voice. And so once they're calm, once I'm calm, that's the time to collaboratively problem solve what happened, what they wanted when they were upset, how we could get that next time in a way that is helpful to them and to everyone around them. I really love Dr. Ross Green's collaborative and proactive solutions, and I use that all the time in the classroom. Now, I didn't always know how to do this. I remember in my first permanent position, on one of the first days, a student shredded paper over my head. And then he would do things like I'd be trying to show a video on the smartboard, and he would run up and try and touch all the YouTube videos in the side panel. And the way the board is designed, you can't actually override it with the mouse at the computer. And it was so frustrating. And I just didn't know how to make that connection with him. And I would, every morning on my drive-in, I would say a mantra to myself, and this is from Russell Barkley. Every child, the children who need love the most often ask for it in the most unloving ways. And I would try and have that patience that came with that statement. And I decided each morning I would sit down with him. We would do a calming activity together. We would draw class banners, or I would ask for his help setting up my computer, or I would let him walk 5 paces in front of me, and I would give him the keys to my classroom and ask him to open the door. So I was trying to find ways to build trust and build mutual respect. And there came a time where we clicked, and all of the behaviors that I found so challenging really decreased. And that taught me it's about more than consequences. It's about more than blaming. We should never blame the child, but we should consider under what circumstances they do well and under what circumstances they do not do so well. And then ask ourselves, how can I make this environment and my teaching more supportive of them for next time? And I tell all my students, every day is a clean slate for both of us. We all want to belong. And this card was made by my students for my birthday last year. And this stayed up on my desk till the end of June. And I love it because every time I look at it, and I hope every time they noticed it, it reminded us of the closeness of our group and all the things that we learned together. And one of the students that I taught used to describe our classroom as like a puzzle where every piece fits. And I think we want that for all of the students in our classes. It's become more and more apparent to me that we have to teach interdependence to our students. We want to really listen to them, seek their input, and find ways for them to see themselves reflected in the classroom. And I learned this quite early on when I had a student, again, in my first permanent position. I was having trouble connecting with him. And then one day I heard him talking to classmates that he really wanted to go rock climbing. And I thought, I wonder if I can do this. So I talked to admin, I talked to parents, I did some research, and I came back and I told the group in the next session, we were going to go rock climbing. And he looked up at me and he said, no one's ever listened to me before. And from that moment on, our relationship changed. And I started to think about how these students are micromanaged in so many ways. And it made me think students need not just to see themselves reflected, they need to feel their impact. So I ask my students for help all the time. Even if I don't really need it, I'll ask their advice for setting up the computer. I will explicitly connect any request I make to impact. So I won't just say, could you please hand this out? I will say, could you help me by handing this out? And then I thank them afterwards. And my last three takeaways, of course, are listen, learn, and love. And I love what I do every day.
This may look overwhelming at first. This is kind of my crazy vision of what the table of contents of my book would look like if it didn't have to be text and didn't have to be in an order. Probably one of the hardest things about writing the book was figuring out what needed to go where first. And I would start with one thing and then I would think, no, that's not it. It needs to be this. It needs to be this. And in all honesty, to pull it all together, you need to know a little bit about all of it. So in this visual, it's the centerpiece, of course, is understanding behavior, and then the circles around it go in any order that you need in any particular context. And even as I go through the slideshow, I don't think I've gone clockwise or counterclockwise. I think I've jumped around to the things that I feel like we need to talk about in the moment. You'll also notice I talk a lot with my hands. I'll try not to do that, but it's going to happen. So what we have and what we're going to look at tonight are contributing factors to behavior, because as you know, or perhaps you don't, behavior happens for a reason, and that reason is that something is maintaining the behaviors. So we're going to look at a lot of the different contributing factors, and I'm hoping it just allows you to maybe think about some of your more challenging kids a little bit deeper. We're going to look, so I'm starting at the contributing factors, and I'll talk about this clockwise. We're going to look at making a behavior plan. We do have a specific model in my province that we follow, but I don't think you need to follow any specific model as long as you've got all the components there. We're going to talk a little bit about reinforcement. That's often hard because sometimes I'll have a lot of the audience members know a lot about reinforcement and some not know very much at all. So we'll try to give a bit of an overview that will be pertinent to you wherever your knowledge is on that one. We're going to look at predictability. And the fact that students need that, or if they can have that, it certainly makes challenging behaviors a little bit easier for them to manage, which then makes it easier for us to manage. And then it's all about relationships, and it absolutely is, and we'll look at that too. When you look at behavior, if you were to look at the theory, there's reinforcement and then there's punishment. So there's positive reinforcement and there's negative reinforcement. The positive just means that you're adding something, you're getting something, and the negative means that you're removing something, but reinforcement means that the behavior you're looking to increase does increase. With punishment, you're looking at something to decrease, but punishment is not, it sometimes works faster than reinforcement, which kind of hooks people on it, but it doesn't necessarily do what we want in the long run for the kids. So yes, if you scream at somebody when they did something wrong, they might not do that wrong thing again, but it doesn't necessarily teach replacement behaviors. So positive reinforcement is the one part of reinforcement that I'm going to focus on tonight. It's, of all of them, it's the one thing I think if people could do, you'll see the biggest bang for your buck. It may take a little longer to get there. Your results won't be instant, but you'll see positive behaviors increase. We'll have replacement behaviors. You'll have a lot of positive things come out of it. People won't be reacting out of fear of a punishment or a consequence. They'll just kind of learn the better way to do things, or the more appropriate way to do things in that setting. And before we get super huge into that, I know there are people out there, probably in your schools, and maybe in fact you were or are one, who think that reinforcing is a student. So I've often heard, what? Why would you give that person a sticker or an extra or whatever it is they're working for, when, little Sally's been perfect all year, she's straight A's, she hasn't missed a day, she hasn't whatever, where's her sticker? How is that fair? And there's a lot of pushback on that. And the short answer to that is little Sally is reinforced all day long. When you smile at her, when you say great work, when you give her a 17 out of 20, when you whatever, those are all really reinforcing for little Sally. It's probably why she's doing as well as she is, why she's there every day, and why she's as successful as she is. For some of our kids, the smile doesn't mean anything to them. It's not been paired with anything. It's sometimes some of our kids aren't even really aware of our body language and our facial expressions and things like that. So although we're treating them exactly the same way we're treating little Sally, they're not being reinforced with it in the same way that Sally is. So unless we even that playing field a little bit, then it's not fair to that student. Relationships are probably really hard if you're to the point where you're really frustrated. And sometimes it doesn't take long to get to that point. And the thing that I found interesting is when I first did my behavior course, it was just all about the behavior. It was kind of, you don't look at anything else. You look specifically at the behavior, you target that behavior, you address that behavior, and it didn't deal anything with relationships. And then you take in some PDs, Jody Carrington being one that I can think of off the top of my head, and they're saying like it's all about the relationship. And so you have two different sides of the pendulum, and I know somewhere in the middle is probably that perfect balance. But one thing that I've heard over and over from many presenters is these kids, the kids that you see the behaviors from, the kids whose ACEs are probably sky high, those are the kids who they might not notice that you're smiling, they might not get your body language, they might not whatever, but they know if you like them. And that's repeated over and over. And when I think back on all the kids that I've dealt with, I can see that they probably do have a good feel of who likes them and who doesn't. So when people say it's all about relationships, relationships are really important. I would never recommend trying to fake interest in something you weren't interested in, because people can see through that really quickly, especially those kids. But if you can find something that you have in common with that student, then by all means, and maybe it's the fact that Buffalo Bills are the best and they agree, and who we love Josh Allen, then yeah, I would talk about that every morning at the beginning of class just to strike up a relationship with that student. Predictability. If you can be predictable for your students, it helps. So a lot of our kids hate not knowing what's coming next, but even more than that, they hate when you change what's supposed to be next. I was doing an observation in a classroom when I was autism consultant, and of course every morning they played O Canada, but there had been a 1 hour school delay, so they didn't play O Canada. Well, my little fellow on the spectrum stood up and sang it anyways, the whole thing. And everyone else was trying to do the work that the teacher had assigned, and this little guy wasn't going to move till O Canada was sung. And again, it's just kind of a cute example, but routine and schedule are huge for really for everybody. I mean, think about people in your school who are a little rigid when things change. You know, how many teachers say, yeah, no, you need to tell me, please, when there's going to be a fire drill, even though it's supposed to be the unannounced one. So even as adults, we're kind of rigid and we like routine and predictability. For the kids, it's 3 times that, if not more than that. When you make a behavior plan, you need to start with data. So if you're making it for your own student, or if somebody comes to you, they're going to say, this is happening all the time and I can't do it anymore. What do you mean all the time? Well, what's triggering anything? It's all the time, I can't do it. Get a little bit of data. So they do recommend 2 weeks, but if you or your teacher's at a breaking point, I wouldn't say suffer for the next 2 weeks, but let's get some data about what exactly is happening and when it's happening. You'll look at that data to determine what you think the function of the behavior is. So if every time Donna lines up to come in from school and she's punching the kids behind her in line or shoving the people in front of her and going straight to the office, let's look at what she's avoiding. Oh, well, guess what? Math came next. It was going to be come in from recess and go to math. She's avoiding math. You may see patterns like that come out in the data. So you may understand the function of that behavior and be able to kind of work around that. So if we know she's going to have the issue in the lineup and we know that it's to avoid math, perhaps if math showed up in the office, she's going to realize she's not avoiding math at all. So there's no point to have those issues in the lineup. There are all sorts of things that you can try, and hopefully you do have a team who can help you brainstorm around that.
So I want to talk a little bit about why I say autistic students and not students with autism. So in education, we have traditionally said students with autism. But as I was doing research and as I was talking with autistic adults, I found out that in the autistic community, they prefer to be called autistic, so autistic students, and not with autism. The reason is they think that with autism sounds like they have a disease. And they're very clear autism is not a disease. And also, they feel that autism is part of their personality, part of their identity, and so they want to be called autistic. So I have changed from saying with autism to saying autistic students. Now I'm still learning, so you might find me catching up. You know, I might make a mistake here and there, but you'll find throughout this presentation and throughout the book, I say autistic students or autistic people, trying to honor what I have found to be the preferred terminology in the autistic community. So I want to talk a bit about the changing paradigm around autism. We're sort of halfway through a paradigm shift in education, and we know that it's sort of here and there's more coming, and so I just want to clearly lay it out so we're clear how it goes. And there's two kind of areas. The first is, it used to be when I first started teaching, there were no autistic students in my classes. So that was like 23, 24 years ago. They were all in their own autistic classes. And in my class, there were mostly students, like no students with autism. But now I teach in Southeast Scarborough, which is part of Toronto that's sort of on the lower income scale. I usually have one or two autistic students in my class every year, and most teachers have one or two autistic students. And that is going only to increase with the changes in legislation in Ontario. We will see more and more autistic students in the mainstream classes. And so this is also changing how we teach. So I want to talk a little bit about how do we teach then, right? So that it's not so difficult. The second sort of changing paradigm is that we used to consider autism a disease or a disability, and it's still listed as a disability. However, the autistic community has been speaking out and saying, this is not a disease, this is a different way of being. So when I started teaching, the definition of normal was a very narrow definition. And the changing paradigm is the definition of normal is widening to include more and more people as we become a more and more inclusive society, right? So what's happening is a very famous lady with autism called Temple Grandin. She is a very famous speaker for autistic people and also in animal behaviorism. I think she has a double PhD in both of those areas. And she says that if she could, snap her fingers and change from like to not be autistic at all, she wouldn't do it because she would lose part of who she is, and part of who she is really needed by our society. She says that, a little bit of autism is good for creative people, and truthfully, maybe we can think of people who are creative who we think, oh, maybe they are a little bit autistic, and truthfully, autistic people have brought so much to our society, and so the paradigm is changing where we're starting to acknowledge autism is not only a weakness, it is also a strength, right? So, and we're including more things in normal, right? In our definition of normal. So that's the changing paradigm. And we're sort of partway through this paradigm shift in education. So I just want to make it clear so we can sort of see where that's going. The next thing we're going to do to prepare for our autistic students is we're going to talk with the parents. So if we know, like sometimes we know the year ahead that we're going to have an autistic student in our class, and we can go talk with the parents even the year before. But if not, the first week of school, as soon as we can, because the parents are the experts. I don't know if you've ever spoken with parents of autistic children. They sound like doctors. They have so much lingo going on because autism has its own vocabulary, right? And, they have so much lingo going on, and, they know they've been to this community center, and over here there's a resource they're using, and, they have a lot of information. And so when we talk with them, we can get, lots of information about what might work with their student, with their child, what might not work with them. And we want to work with them as partners because it's just easier. And I have to tell you, you probably already know this, parents of autistic children have been blamed for their child's behavior all of their child's life. And they're tired of it. And my friend who has an autistic boy says, she has 3 boys and the middle one's autistic. And she says, do you think I parented him any differently from the other 2? I did not. So we want to be part of the solution for these parents, not part of the problem. Many people I spoke with, many educators I spoke with, especially EAs who work mostly with autistic students, told me every autistic student, you have to find how to unlock their walls. It's like, especially the younger ones, it's like they're locked in behind these walls, and you have to find what will open up the walls and help them do their work. And so it's kind of like you're like a detective. You're finding out, is it that they like, the very little children, do they like SpongeBob? And if you put SpongeBob stickers on all their work, they'll do it because there's SpongeBob there. Is it the older students really like computers? And if you put all their work on the computer, they'll do it? Like, what is it that helps them, unlocks the walls to learning? So we're sort of like a detective. And one of the ways to unlock their walls is to use strengths. Did you know that until about 5 years ago, all of the research on autism was focused on weaknesses? And this one autistic researcher realized that there were absolutely no studies on autistic strengths. And she did the first ever study on autistic strengths. Isn't that crazy? That was 5 years ago. And of course, we know that autistic people, they're often very detail-oriented. They have a good memory, and they will tell you what you said last week. Miss Yuill, you said we could have a movie next week. Remember, Miss Yuill? Oh, yes, I remember, even though I had actually forgot. Right? Or a lot of them think in pictures and are very good at knowing how things will fit together, like there's lots of strengths. And so when we use our autistic students' strengths, that can really help them to want to learn.
And now more than ever with, virtual and online teaching, with the different classrooms and the differences in curriculum and changing technologies, and with so much going on, we really need to have that support from not just a formal mentor that a school board may or may not assign to us, but also from our peers, so that we can actually mentor each other and be there for each other. It's a stressful profession in education, and I would argue that that's always been true. But it's our friends and our colleagues that make it a wonderful profession and get us through those challenging times. Really, what is a mentoring partnership, and why is that really valuable for you? Well, for me, a mentor creates an open and inclusive environment that encourages a mentee to demonstrate the best of their professional self, to take calculated risks in practice, and to become the professional self that they aspire to be. And, that can be challenging, and particularly in the early years of teaching, that can be really challenging to be your best professional self when a lot of times you're just sort of trying to get it all organized and hold it all together. But when you're part of a relationship, a mentoring partnership, where you can, call on somebody else to give you ideas, when you're feeling down, they can, make you feel more enthusiastic and nurture you along. When they can encourage you to take risks in your practice, or maybe when you have something that you think you're going to do and you think it's a brilliant idea and you share it with your mentoring partner and they say, did you really think about this or that before you undertake that? And so having that partner there is really more than just a mentoring partner, but it's a lifeline. And oftentimes we think of mentors as somebody who is older and somebody who is wiser and has a lot more experience. That's not necessarily so. A mentor can be anybody. And when I was in my first year at that school I was telling you about, there was another first year teacher there at the same time. And we became friends. It was 20 years ago. We became friends, not social friends. We didn't hang out on weekends or get together with our families, but we became professional friends. And we mentored each other through so many different things. And even to this day, we still stay in touch. She's now a principal, and I've been at the university for many years, but we haven't lost touch. And we still, communicate on Facebook and run ideas by each other from time to time. And it was such a rewarding relationship. And it was because of her, a lot of times, that I had the courage to put my ideas into practice. It was because of her then that sometimes, when I was feeling really discouraged, she would be the one that would keep me on track. And one of the ideas that people have often about mentors is that a mentor is a model, that, you model something for somebody. And this happens a lot of times in classrooms with teacher candidates and more experienced teachers. The teacher models something and then the teacher candidate is supposed to, sort of mimic it or reproduce it. And in that way, the teacher candidate almost becomes in some ways, a copy of the mentor teacher. But in essence, the role of the mentor teacher is not a model, but it's a mentor who will offer an invitation to an inclusive and safe and welcoming physical and virtual and or intellectual space where both the mentor and the mentee or co-mentors can thrive, explore new ways to enhance their practice and develop their teaching experience together. I have a couple of ideas here. I have two little things that you might want to think about. We call them mentoring moves in our book. There's 29 of them. And these are short, quick things that you can do with a partner, with another colleague. Most of the 29 are easily applicable to doing with your students as well. You can actually do them in your classroom. But the first one is called walk and talk. Because a lot of times, if you just sort of go walking with somebody, you're not making that direct eye contact as you're walking side by side. It's kind of like they always say you should talk to your teenage kids about behavior issues in the car because you don't have to make eye contact. But, you walk and talk. And I mean, one thing teachers need, particularly in these trying times, is just a breather. Out of the school, 20 minutes at lunch, a couple of loops around the block, walk and talk. And our mentoring move provides some basically sentence starters, some conversation openers, things to really help you talk about your practice, talk about what you're doing, what you wish you were doing, what you love about what you're doing, where you want to go, what some of the challenges are that you're having, and gives you the opportunity just to listen to each other and to get some feedback from each other. The next one is called positivity as practice. And that's a wonderful way, particularly when you're working with a colleague or a friend as a mentor. Sometimes they ask you for feedback and you think, gee, I don't want to offend you. I don't want to, say the wrong thing. And I know you're trying hard, but hey, I know you need some feedback here. So in the positivity as practice, we've got some questions that if your colleague asks you for feedback that you can ask. When during that lesson did you feel those kids really got it? When did you feel best about the lesson? What do you think the kids were thinking when they were doing that final activity? Where did you see some challenges that they might be having? If you had just one thing that you had to do to improve that lesson, what might that one thing be? And if there was one thing about that lesson that you really didn't want to give up and that you would even incorporate into other lessons, then what might that be? And so those types of sort of easy sentence starters, again, that kind of a conversation can be had on a lunch break and a walk around the block, online or after school. So all of the things in the book are things that you can easily do with each other.